What is the judicial branch?
How does the judicial branch impact our lives? These questions came to mind as we learned more about the U.S. government this semester. So we embarked on a quest to learn just that: how our state judicial branch works, what makes it unique, and how it impacts citizens like us.
One thing is clear from this experience. There is much more to the judicial branch than many Iowans realize. So let's climb the stairs to the judicial building and start our journey.
The Judicial Department was founded in Article 5 of the Constitution of the State of Iowa, saying, "The judicial power shall be vested in a Supreme Court, district courts, and such other courts inferior to the Supreme Court as the General Assembly may, from time to time, establish." Its purpose is as follows: the Supreme and District Courts shall be conservators of the peace throughout the state.
So, keeping the peace. That's all the Constitution said when it came to the job of the judicial branch. But how do they actually do it? Here's when the real job comes in. Let's start with the Iowa Court of Appeals.
I shadowed the staff attorney for the chief judge on the appeals court, Sandee Lyons, and appeals judge Warren. Here's what I learned. The Court of Appeals is a court on the state level that deals with cases already decided by a district court. If a party is unsatisfied with the result of a case, they can appeal to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court then assigns a vast majority of their appealed cases to the Court of Appeals.
The Iowa Court of Appeals is a diversionary court. That means that cases that have gone to trial or that to a jury or to a judge and have been decided in a lower court then is appealed to the Iowa Supreme Court, at which point the Supreme Court will send or transfer those cases to us unless they believe that it is an issue of great importance that they keep for themselves. We, as a court, decided this year, or were transferred this year, about over 1,400 cases, and that's a substantial increase from the years before.
The cases are reviewed by the appeals judges, but not in the traditional courtroom style.
We have 9 judges on our court, and they sit in panels of 3, and those 3 judges change depending on what session we're in. We also have a couple of senior judges, somewhere between 3 and 6 senior judges who will help us and sit in panels with the sitting judges. The panels will either decide a case based on the briefs and the oral or the legal arguments, or in some cases there will be oral argument granted, and those cases tend to be ones where the judges believe that oral argument of attorneys will help them decide the questions presented. The judges each have been issuing about or authoring about 100 or more cases a year, but then they also have to decide with their panel an additional 200 plus cases. So we are a court that decides a large number of cases in a short amount of time, basically.
The Court of Appeals is a very recent addition to the Iowa Judicial Branch. As you heard, the Iowa Constitution only set up the district courts and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was becoming overwhelmed by the volume of appeals they were receiving, and in 1976 finally asked the Iowa legislature to create and fund a new court that could be an intermediate court between the Supreme and district courts. Today, around 95% of family law appeals, a majority of criminal appeals, and most of the civil non-family appeals are dealt with by the Court of Appeals.
It's also part of what our system is here for, is that without a process that is fair to all parties, justice in the sense that we think about it can't be done. So I am here in this part of my career to try to be a part of a process that works for everybody and protects the citizens of Iowa.
In the words of Judge Warren, the role of the judges is to review each case individually by applying the law to each given set of facts in the best way possible. That's a glimpse into the Iowa Appellate Court. Next, we move on to the Iowa Supreme Court.
Taking a trip up to the 3rd floor of the judicial building, we arrive at the Department of the Iowa Supreme Court. Here is where I shadowed Supreme Court Justice Ed Mansfield. Comprised of 7 justices and created along with the Constitution of the state of Iowa, the Supreme Court is the highest level court in the state, focusing on only 100 cases that are deemed the most important every year. These cases are held as oral arguments, where the justices don't decide who is guilty or not guilty, but instead listen to each side of an argument and release an official statement on their decision a couple weeks later. The process of becoming a justice in Iowa is quite lengthy and thought out. Judicial nominees are selected by the State Judicial Nominating Commission. The governor then makes the appointment from the list submitted by the commission. 1 year after the appointment, the justice must stand for retention in the next general election. If they're not retained, their term ends on December 31st following the election. Once retained, justices serve for 8-year terms until they reach the mandatory retirement age of 72.
I graduated from law school in 1982. I spent a year clerking for a federal court of appeals judge. Then I spent 13 years practicing law with a law firm in Phoenix, Arizona, and then moved to Iowa and spent 13 years practicing law with a firm here in Des Moines. In early 2009, I was named by Governor Culver to the Iowa Court of Appeals and served on that court for a little over 2 years. And then in 2011, I was appointed by Governor Branstad to this court.
During my shadowing, I was able to witness the last 3 oral arguments being heard for 2016 on Thursday, December 15th.
The first case is an insurance bad faith case. It's brought by a gentleman who was severely injured, paralyzed as a result of an accident while he was doing his job. He was driving a truck. And he sued the workers' compensation carrier, the insurance carrier, for bad faith conduct and recovered $284,000 in damages and an additional $25 million in punitive damages.
Let me just do this very quickly and chronologically. Of course, on June 25th of '09, Mr. Thornton was paralyzed. He became a quadriplegic and was immediately rendered unemployable. He received Social Security disability benefits very shortly after that. Indeed, the defendant, a multi-billion-dollar national company, adjusted its reserves immediately to reflect permanent total disability.
The second case is State versus Graham, and this involves a juvenile offender who was 17 when he basically raped a younger girl. And as a result of his conviction, he is subject to some long-term restrictions on what he can do even after he gets out of prison. And so he's challenging those restrictions, arguing that they should not apply to juvenile offenders, only to adult offenders. So that's the second case we're hearing.
Here today representing defendant appellant Bradley Graham. In 2010, he pleaded guilty to 1 count of sexual abuse in the 3rd degree based on having a sex act with a 13-year-old girl. The defendant was 17 at the time.
The third case we're hearing arises out of confrontation in a bar. The bar owner or the bartender, whatever it was, asked them to leave, but directed one of them to leave first, hoping that he would be able to separate the two individuals. And so the first man left, and then later the second man left, and the first man apparently stabbed the second man outside the bar.
Do you agree there was substantial evidence or a reasonable jury could infer that he had a knife at the time he was in the bar playing pool?
Yes. My client denied. He testified he denied having a knife.
Well, it didn't come out of the sky, I don't take
Right,
it.
and we haven't challenged sufficiency of the evidence on.
The Iowa Supreme Court has a history of progressive rulings and has been ahead of the times even before Iowa was a state. They recognized the rights of a former slave, and in more recent years, Iowa was the 4th state to legalize same-sex marriage. This proud history is the foundation of our Supreme Court.
Like we talked about earlier, the judicial branch and its processes are, in many ways, connected and based off the founding principles of our government. We believe 4 of the principles are key to the work of the Iowa Judicial Branch. These are judicial review, checks and balances, federalism, and separation of powers.
Judicial review stands as the principle of government that impacts the judicial branch the most.
Then the 7 of us on the court will go back and meet in our conference room, and we'll discuss the cases in kind of a round-robin fashion. Each of the 7 of us gets a turn to talk and give their views on that particular case. One of the judges will be assigned to write an opinion in the case, and usually that opinion will come out, say, 30 days to 60 days afterwards.
As explained here, the job of the Supreme Court is to check the constitutionality of a case, which is an example of judicial review, defined as the review by the Supreme Court of the constitutional validity of a case or legislative act. The next principle that plays a key role in the judicial branch of the state of Iowa is federalism. Federalism is the partnership between our various levels of government, including national, state, and local. The judicial branch of Iowa is able to run the court systems around the state because of this special relationship. The national government allots some of its power to state government so that they can deal with local problems that they are closer to, leaving the national issues at the national level. Our judicial branch's influence over the whole state of Iowa is given because of the federalism idea.
We sit as a check and balance to the other branches of government. For instance, if the legislature passes a law, then sometimes this court will, and the Supreme Court, will be required to decide whether that legislation is constitutional or not. And when it comes to the executive branch, the way that the governor runs the government of the state of Iowa, sometimes those questions are presented to us. For instance, when the governor closed the mental health hospitals here in Iowa, that case came to the court. But we are also reliant on those other two branches of government.
Yeah.
The legislature provides us with our financial backing. We are also, in a sense, dependent upon the governor's office because the governor takes the recommendation of the Judicial Nominating Commission on what judges would be qualified to sit as judges.
Although it is impressed upon students in every government course, checks and balances are truly foundational to the roles and jobs of the government. Like Sandee discussed, the judicial branch's power is balanced and checked by both the legislative and executive branches. There is a huge overlap between the legislature and the state courts in Iowa because almost all offenses are actually statute or written law. This means there is little common law in Iowa. So, when our judges make a decision on a case, they're basing their decision on laws created and written by the Iowa legislature.
Like in Iowa, all crimes are created by the legislature. So anytime somebody has been convicted of a crime, that is by legislative action, and as a court, the court has to determine what the words of the legislature intend.
The other principle that plays a key role in the judicial branch is separation of powers. In creating our Constitution, the Founding Fathers divided the roles of a democratic government between three branches. The powers of the judicial branch are granted because of the separation of powers principle. The judiciary is performing a third of the government's responsibilities to the citizens of Iowa.
So at the end of the day, what is important to remember?
After observing and job shadowing in the judicial building, I feel like I left with a much greater appreciation for the job the judicial branch performs, and I feel that if I were in trouble and I needed to appeal my case to the state level courts, that I would trust in the system much more because I know that the respect and care that the judges put into each case and how much they value the process of the judicial system. They're all there because they are making a difference in their community by receiving cases, reading them, and making decisions. And I think that's a really incredibly selfless job to do, and they do it really well.
These cases, I mean, these are decisions made about the things going on around you, for people around you. And understanding how important it is, like understanding that and understanding that, you know, in a way, everything going on here does impact you is probably the most important thing that anyone can pick up out of this.